we're in this lived moment. That's also mentioned in here, that Christianity or evangelicalism is a lived religion. Elaborate. I know that's not a chapter that you wrote in this book, but I think it's imperative and important for us to understand, what does it mean to be a lived faith in this moment when it comes to understanding or self-identifying under this term of evangelicalism?
Yes, I mean, the lived component would relate to very strong historical precedents where people who are known for defining themselves in relationship to God's free grace in Christ have, in many instances, taken certain actions in society and in organization of their families and approaching to life in the world that carry on the meaning, extend the meaning of reconciliation between individuals and God to reconciliation among individuals on the earth. I mean, that way of framing things means, well, we're back to the Franciscans in the Middle Ages, because they were known as evangelicals partly for what they believed, but more for how they acted. And when you come to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther is a fountainhead of what are later considered to be essential evangelical traits, but you wouldn't want to follow Martin Luther in how he late in his life began to attack the Jews. I mean, from his angle, he was following through consistently. From my angle, that was a gross deviation. But when Martin Luther writes to his barber and to lay we're struggling with things that have happened in their lives, and he offers them a scriptural account of how Christ stands with the brokenhearted. Christ is with those who have suffered great trauma. Then you say, well, there, from my perspective, is evangelical action that comports with the evangelical belief in how people are reconciled to God. You come into later history, and again, you just have to emphasize the complexity of things, even though it takes time to explain. George Whitefield is an evangelical and insisting upon the new birth is a key matter. And then in the generation after Whitefield, there'll be a few people who take that very seriously and say, well, if we're talking about God's valuation of people such that Christ died that they could be born again, don't we want to follow through and say that the human dignity implied really speaks against the enslavement of Black Africans? And so there is, by the end of the 18th century, some evangelical, joined by some Quakers who aren't real evangelical, a kind of active anti-slavery. But, and here you just gotta talk about the complexity. George Whitefield himself is empathetic to people in enslavement, but also is a defender eventually of the slave system in the American colonies. So is George Whitefield an evangelical? Well, clearly he is in emphasizing the new birth, but in Lausanne Covenant terms, when Whitefield turns from being sympathetic to enslaved people and chastising slave owners for mistreatment of their enslaved people, while he defends the slave system, you'd say that's not very evangelical. The action is not comporting with the doctrine. Now, that of course is my reading of the historical situation. There would be others right through the 19th century, and you can even find a few today, Bible believers who would say, well, if you read the Bible very carefully, you can see that the scriptures really do not rule out slavery as a system of organizing labor. That was a very common conclusion, North as well as South, among white people. through the Civil War, and it continues to be a conclusion. There were people at the time who pointed out, well, whatever the Bible has to say about slavery, it's always white people doing it to white people, or Caucasians doing it to Caucasians. And here we're talking about a slave system set up that enslaves only African. Can that be approved by? Well, then there's huge debate. So the debates were coming out of the impulse that you were talking about. If you have an evangelical understanding of God's free grace in Christ given to unworthy sinners, you're saying something really definite about the value of unworthy sinners. All human unworthy sinners. And if you believe in that kind of value, God-given image of God, possibility to be redeemed in all humanity, how can you undermine that sense by practicing a form of racially specific slavery in which many of the very express commands of the Bible about paying laborers, whether they're hired, and so on and so forth, so it's a debate. You can see it's debate, but your sense that evangelical has to mean something in practice is why people who agreed on the evangelical character of the belief argued so much about and had such really bitter battles as to what it means to live as a faithful Christian. And in the 20th century, we have the same thing. Early part of the 20th century, historians talk blithely, quickly about the fundamentalist modernist controversy. It's really never that simple. But a fundamentalist would be characterized as someone who thinks the great sins in life are drunkenness, wasting your time on worldly entertainments. Whereas other branches of Protestant Christianity, Catholic Christianity would say the great evils of life are when you run a business and keep pushing down, lowering wages for your workers, or you allow cities to develop with no concern for how women are being mistreated and non-whites are being mistreated. Well, that's a modernist way of trying to put Christianity to use, so-called, and a fundamentalist so-called way of trying to put Christianity to use. But they're both coming out of the sense that if you have a belief in how God reconciles people to himself, then you've got to have a practice. I think one of the really great contributions of historical scholarship in America is to see how clearly evangelical in their traditions were the modernists, because they were the people who were taking action on things like urban development, economic life, following right in the tradition of people like Charles Grandison Finney, who said, well, slavery is terrible. And of course, the fundamentalists are coming right out of the evangelical tradition in what they emphasize. So the debates in Christian circles are often about beliefs, and those are, of course, very important debates. But almost always also those arguments about belief come along with arguments about what it means to put the faith into practice. Evangelical traditions are traditions that see the necessity of living out in the world according to the principles, standards, guidance, models found in the belief. Now, that's not the only Christian groups that do that, but that activism is just essential. But activism to what end? To what goals? By what standards? By what protocols? Those are always matters for debate.